Hey guys, Prince Asbel here. Today is July 2nd, 2016, and it marks the 79th anniversary of the disappearance of Amelia Earhart over the Pacific Ocean. Like me, you may have grown up thinking that Amelia Earhart was an amazing woman because, among other things, she was the first woman to fly the Atlantic. As it turns out though, Amelia Earhart is just not as extraordinary as most people would like her to be. In fact, there's some pretty outrageous facts about Amelia Earhart that just aren't talked about nowadays, and that's what we're going to look at. Amelia Earhart's initial claim to fame came not from her solo flight across the Atlantic, but in a flight she took across the Atlantic in 1928. It was not a solo flight. In fact, even though she was one of the licensed pilots at the time, she wasn't one of the people flying the aircraft. Amelia Earhart said, "It was a grand experience, but all I did was lie on my tummy and take pictures of the clouds. We didn't see much of the ocean. Stultz did all the flying. Had to. I was just baggage like a sack of potatoes." And this is the flight that made her famous way before she made her solo flight across the Atlantic. Amelia Earhart was amazing just for being a woman who has flown over the ocean like a suitcase. And I'll be darned if websites like Amazon.com aren't outright ignoring that fact when they sell Amelia's book documenting this flight. They describe her as the first woman pilot to accomplish the feat. It's like, dude, did you even read the book that you're selling right now? Actually, it seems reasonable that Amelia wasn't the one flying the plane. It turns out she wasn't exactly the best pilot who ever lived. In the Sound of Wings book it reads, "It was not a plane for a beginner," she said, and in Netta's opinion, Amelia was very much a beginner. This was underlined when one day on a dual instruction flight, Amelia headed for Long Beach without telling Netta of her intention to make what was then regarded as a reasonably long flight. Netta soon suspected Amelia's destination and doubted the plane's ability to make the flight in the headwinds unless the tank was full of fuel. Cutting the throttle and yelling to Amelia, she queried the fuel situation. "Did you check it personally?" Amelia shook her head. "Mr. Kinner always keeps it full," she shouted back. Netta grimly opened the throttle, turned the plane, and headed for home. On their return, they were met by a worried Bert Kinner, who informed them that he had not filled the Kinner the night before because he'd been waiting for the fuel tanker to arrive the next day. Not for the first time, Netta angrily wondered whether she hadn't misjudged her friend's ability. That's not the only critical thing said about Amelia Earhart's flying capabilities. According to C.V. Glines, there is no denying that Earhart had difficulty learning to fly. It took her more than 15 hours of flight time and nearly a year to solo the Kinner, and she had a number of mishaps afterward, most of them during landings. As one biographer noted, "Unfortunately, though highly intelligent, a quick learner, and possessed of great enthusiasm, Amelia did not, it seems, possess natural ability as a pilot." So far, we have a female pilot who lacks natural ability as a pilot, took a really long time to train, made plenty of mistakes afterwards after all of that long training, took one massive risk during training that could have killed her and her instructor, and even a plane ride where she wasn't even the pilot, she was just being flown along for the ride. And this is the same woman who was dubbed Lady Lindy as though she were the female equivalent of Charles Lindbergh, a man who just the year before had done a solo flight across the Atlantic. And yet, Amelia became famous immediately, not years later when she did her own solo flight across the Atlantic. She became famous right then and there, even though she hadn't accomplished anything. You might be thinking, well, she still deserved to become famous because, like Charles Lindbergh, she did complete a solo transatlantic flight. And yes, she did complete a flight like he did, sort of, in 1932, years later. And I'm going to explain to you what I mean by sort of. First, let's look at flight time. Amelia Earhart spent 14 hours and 56 minutes flying. Charles Lindbergh had to fly for 33.5 hours. Charles Lindbergh's plane had a 225 horsepower engine. Amelia Earhart's had 500. Charles Lindbergh's plane was a tiny one-seat plane. Amelia Earhart's plane was a 6-passenger airliner. The maximum speed of Charles Lindbergh's plane was 135 miles per hour. Amelia Earhart's plane had a maximum speed of 185 miles per hour. Her cruise speed was 165 miles per hour. Let me point that out again. Amelia Earhart's plane's optimal economic speed was 30 miles faster than Charles Lindbergh's plane flying at full capacity. At her maximum speed, she was 50 miles per hour faster than him. Charles Lindbergh began his flight at Roosevelt Field, New York, and flew all the way to the Paris-Le Bourget Airport. That's approximately 3,600 nautical miles. Amelia Earhart began her flight not at Roosevelt Field, New York, but in Harbor Grace, Newfoundland in Canada. The distance between Harbor Grace, Newfoundland and the Paris-Le-Bourget airport is 2,500 miles, not 3,600. She shaved 1,100 miles off the distance Lindbergh had to fly 5 years earlier. Oh, and Charles Lindbergh actually made it to Paris. Amelia did not. She wound up landing in a cow field at Londonderry, Northern Ireland, and as a result, she wound up flying only 2,000 miles, cutting off another 500 miles in addition to the 1,100 she'd cut off from the beginning. In summary, Amelia accomplished her transatlantic flight in a plane that was at least twice as powerful as Charles Lindbergh's, in a plane that was much larger than his, in a plane that was at least 30 miles per hour faster than his plane, flew barely more than half the distance he did. Oh, and also she flew less than half the time he did. Sorry, forgot to include that in the video. Missed her destination by almost 600 miles, but she technically crossed the Atlantic, and therefore she proved that women can do anything that men can do. And why? Why did she become famous in spite of all of this? I think it's for the same reason that they called her Lady Lindy. They wanted a woman they could at least pretend had done the same thing a better man had. And the facts didn't really matter. On the first page we looked at the beginning of this video, we find this exact kind of phenomenon happening after Amelia landed in her transatlantic flight back in 1928. Look at what it says. Rayleigh and his party procured a dory, and as they pulled near, he called, "Congratulations! How does it feel to be the first woman to fly the Atlantic?" Her reply was a listless lift of her hand and the single word, "Hello." Greeting Stulton Gordon, Rayleigh scrambled aboard. Obviously, all the crew were dog-tired, but he sensed in Amelia something else, disappointment. He dropped down beside her and asked, "What's the matter? Aren't you excited?" "Excited? No," she replied. In fact, Amelia was prey to emotions that Rayleigh, to whom publicity was the breath of life, was quite incapable of understanding. This was the same young woman who, not so many years ago, had not bothered to pick up her diplomas from high school and finishing school. She had acquired the necessary learning, the symbols thereof and the accompanying ceremonies and congratulations of graduation meant nothing to her. Now she faced a situation in which she would be praised and admired for something she had not done. She had not flown the Atlantic. She had been flown, a horse of a very different hue. She burst out to Rayleigh, "It was a grand experience, but all I did was lie on my tummy and take pictures of the clouds. We didn't see much of the ocean. Stultz did all the flying. Had to. I was just baggage, like a sack of potatoes." Rayleigh replied bracingly, "What of it? You're still the first woman to fly the Atlantic, and what's more, the first woman pilot." Evidently realizing that Rayleigh could not share her feelings, Amelia summoned up a smile. "Oh, well, maybe someday I'll try it alone." Well, she did. She did a pretty bad job of it, but as Amelia recognized back in 1928, that didn't really matter. Didn't matter to Rayleigh, who seemingly was unaware that Amelia had been trained by another female pilot, and therefore it couldn't possibly be that Amelia was the first female pilot. But I'm pretty sure that wouldn't have mattered to Rayleigh anyways. He had an audience that wanted to believe that a woman had accomplished the same thing a better man had. Ignoring or suppressing the truth seems to have been a bargain price to pay, as long as they could pretend they got what they wanted. Keep that in mind as you see Amelia Earhart articles fill your Facebook and Twitter feeds today. Since the beginning, Amelia Earhart's popularity has never been founded on her actual accomplishments, but upon a massive, massive game of pretend that has been going on for 88 years and counting.